Today's session is brought to you by the Association of CNPs, the professional organization of certified nonprofit professionals. One way the association can be supported is through its membership, and that's by hosting sessions on topics that matter to all of the nonprofit professionals for those who have the CNP and want to continue learning. These events are always free. So if you would like to support the Alliance to continue these free webinars, check the chat. We've dropped a link for ways to donate. And thank you for your support. Today, our speaker is Shay, one of our very own CNPs. Shay Smith is a phenomenal executive director and partner with over 30 years of experience working to support nonprofit entities in a plethora of ways. She loves working to make her community a better place. And we're in for a special treat as he shares with us today plenty of information on that. Without further delay, we'd like to have Shay to talk to us about storytelling as advocacy. Welcome, Shay. The floor is yours.
Thanks, JD. Thank you, everyone, for taking your lunch hour and just coming in to learn a little bit more about this topic. I am an attorney in Nebraska and have been for more than 30 years. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background into how I ended up in advocacy and give everyone some guidance on what you can or can't do as a nonprofit. In this troubled time in our world right now, we need your voices, and our elected leaders need to hear from you. So I'm going to tell you how you can do that in ways that are safe and appropriate right now. First, disclosure. Because I'm an attorney, I have to do the disclosure. I am an attorney. I am a tax practitioner with the IRS. I have done multiple 501c3 startups, managed many of them over the years, but I am only licensed to practice in the state of Nebraska. So if something comes up today that means you want to go ahead and do advocacy or lobbying in a different way for your organization, I still recommend you talk to an attorney licensed in your state in case your state has some different rule that I'm not familiar with.
Shay, before you continue, it looks like some people are having issues with the volume. If you could get closer to the microphone, that might be helpful.
See if that helps us out.
A little bit better, yes.
Okay. I apologize if I'm a little bit close to the video now, but we'll go from there. Let me tell you a little bit about where I started with this particular project and why I found advocacy to be incredibly helpful for our organization. You're seeing a few pictures of a theater in my hometown in Nebraska. It was closed by its last private owner in 2018. It was the only theater in our county. It was built originally in 1926. The individual owner could no longer economically keep it open or viable, and so he closed it. At that point, we realized we'd lost a treasure in our community. So a group of volunteers got together and formed a 501c3 called the Blue River Arts Council. We started working on trying to bring this building back. Interestingly, the building was called the Isis Theater. Isis was a goddess of resurrection in historic Egyptian folklore. So we first had to vote whether or not we were going to keep the name, because obviously there were connotations with the name that weren't anticipated in 1926. But when we learned her history, we chose to keep the name, and we worked with the hashtag Resurrect the Goddess. Yes, that was a photo of my team of women with power tools, by the way. We started demolition of the entry of the vehicle, or of the theater, in 2019 and started just trying to put some plans together. The city actually acquired the building and was willing to hold it so that we could try and figure out renovation. We had a plan, we had a budget, we did all the things you do at the beginning of a capital campaign. And in what we thought was going to be a really fun twist, we actually announced it on Leap Day of 2020. That would be February 29th, 2020. Our community had its first COVID deaths about 3 weeks later. So we announced the end of February, immediately suspended everything in March, and spent the next year just trying to do community building in other ways. We went back to the building to try and look at renovation in 2021. And between 2020 and 2021, we realized the building needed a lot more work than we'd anticipated. There was latent damage we didn't know. Prices for construction had gone through the roof as a result of COVID. And what the city had said was going to be a $650,000 project quickly was closer to $1.8 million. At that point, I knew I didn't know what I was doing. Our community is small in rural Nebraska. No one had ever managed a private capital campaign of that magnitude. And so I went back to school. Literally during COVID, I started my CNP program, and it was the best thing we did for this project and for our community. So we figure out we have no idea how to fund a project this size. And after I did my CNP program, we figured out also that we weren't structured in the best way to allow us to grow as quickly as we needed to grow. So we went back to the chalkboard, literally, after my classes with Nonprofit Leadership Alliance, and we started over. We redid our mission, vision, and values to really focus on what it looked like to be a small organization with a need to grow quickly. And we rewrote our story, and we just started telling it. And that, I think, is where I want everyone to walk away from today. Every nonprofit, every organization you're working with has a story. You're doing what you're doing because someone really cares about your community. You really care about the people you're helping. You really care about the work that you're doing. That elevator speech that we're all told to do is your story. You have the best voice to share that story. And I'm going to explain why just starting to tell our story made a huge difference in this project. But first, we're going to explain why this is a concern and why you have to do it correctly. This is directly from irs.gov. As a 501c3, the organization may lose its exemption, and it may have to pay significant excise tax on its revenue if it violates the influence language in the IRS code. So here is what the IRS government says. What happens is most of us in nonprofit land read that and we are terrified, and we don't want to do anything that's going to violate the law or cause a problem for our organization. As a result, most of us freeze and we don't do anything. And that's not the right answer. There are a lot of things that are allowed by law and encouraged. So if you're telling your story correctly, you should be able to continue to tell it to legislators and to regulatory agencies without concern that you're violating anything. So I'm going to tell you 3 different stories that will give you examples of advocacy that I engaged in while our project was pending. And then we're going to circle back to those after I tell you what the rules are, and you can decide where we went wrong or where we went right. So the first one is I testified before the Nebraska legislature in 2020 for the Shovel Ready Recovery Act. 2021. This bill was pending in the Nebraska legislature, and the intent was to use ARPA money flowing to the state and pass that on to nonprofit organizations who were doing capital campaigns that got stuck because of COVID. So first, we're going to listen quickly to my testimony that day.
Thank you. My name is Shailene Smith. I will spell it Shaylene Smith, SMITH. I am the president of the Blue River Arts Council in Crete, Nebraska, and I'm here today in support of 566 to show you what it looks like from a small town perspective. Crete, we had started renovating the ISIS movie theater. It was built in 1926. It was actually one of the first buildings in the Midwest that had both air conditioning and was built for talkies before they were even released to the public. So we have a historic connotation and a 6,000 square foot footprint in the middle of our downtown that closed in 2018. A group of volunteers took over operations, formed the Arts Council, and started looking at ways to renovate that building. We came together with a plan that's about an $825,000 project. We're cooperating with our city, who purchased the building while we raised the funds for the renovation. We announced the scope of the project in our capital campaign on Leap Day, February 29th, 2020. And 3 weeks later, Saline County was one of the national hotspots for COVID-19. At that point, our organization had to pause anything related to fundraising and focus our attention on community building. We spent the summer bringing in outdoor movie theaters and doing cruise nights and bringing Santa to city parks so the kids could drive by. So we've adjusted our mission to meet COVID-19, but we need to get back in that theater. And the only way that we can do that right now is with a bill like this that would help us. We are more than halfway there. We are handing out our fundraising status, but this is exactly the type of small town project that this shovel-ready program would provide the funding for. You will see our plan attached, so you can see the footprint and what the project looks like. But the other thing I want to point out to you is this map of Crete. You'll see where the theater is, right on our main corridor of Highway 33. You'll also see the main 2 blocks of our Crete downtown. Right now, 50% of our main 2 blocks are empty. We've lost businesses and we've lost industry and we've lost money as a result of COVID-19. We need the shot in the arm and we need the shot of enthusiasm that this project can bring to our small town.
So that's example 1 that we'll circle back to. Example 2, while the city originally had been supportive of our effort to renovate the theater, we obviously had problems throughout the community with COVID. And we started struggling and knew that we weren't going to cross the finish line without government assistance. Our intent had not been to ask for government money. Our intent had been able to do this through foundations and private funders, but it became very clear very quickly that was not going to be possible. We had spent a year with cyclical conversations with our city administrators. Between 2019 and 2023, there had been a change in city administrators and, the city elected officials, and we weren't getting the support from the city that we had hoped to, or it was taking a lot longer than we had hoped. And so we had a snowball gala in January of 23. All of us, I'm sure, do a gala every once in a while. We do it every other year. At the gala, I specifically gave an explanation of the status of the project. That's me in the bottom corner talking to our attendees at our event. And I directly called out the city and county officials, and I cited government programs that could be used to help us meet the funding shortage. We then distributed blank postcards to all of the attendees and invited the attendees to fill out the postcard and write a note to their city elected officials. We collected those and delivered them to the city council and to the county board. I'm not going to lie, it was uncomfortable. The mayor was there, and he's been a great project supporter. And he was uncomfortable, and he got up and left. So that's project number 2. And then I'm going to talk to you about our story number 3. This is the work that was happening inside of the theater. You'll see from the entrance door that we went and made a big portion of the building level and handicapped accessible. That was new to the building. Again, it had been built in 1926. Accessibility was not a concern. At this point in the project, we knew that we had to completely gut the entire building to studs and start over. obviously you can understand that that got expensive very quickly. We were at a point where we were ready for final approval from the state fire marshal for the plans. And the fire marshal added a requirement that they wanted an entire extra exit door in the handicapped accessibility area. Unfortunately, that's also where the bathrooms were going and where the concession stand was going. And to do that would have meant that we had to knock a hole in the side of a 1926 brick building. We were very frustrated. It was going to be an incredibly expensive ad that was going to pause the project for another 6 months or a year. The architect had tried to question some of the requirements with the fire marshal, but we weren't getting satisfactory resolution. I got frustrated. I spent an entire weekend reading the Nebraska Fire Code and learned that there were several exceptions that would apply to our project because it was historical renovation. To make sure I was on the right track, I actually talked to a retired engineer. I wanted to make sure I was using the correct terminology, but I then wrote a letter directly from our organization to the state fire marshal requesting that the exceptions apply and that they take those requirements out of the plan. So that's the third story we're going to circle back to. We're going to talk about the areas of concern. There are basically 3 ways that you can think about influence or advocacy on behalf of your nonprofit. The first is direct political intervention. This is not allowed. As a nonprofit, you are not allowed in any circumstance to endorse a single candidate in a race. You can't show favoritism for any single candidate in a race. You can educate the public as to all candidates' positions if all candidates are invited and treated in an equitable manner. That's an important distinction because there are organizations that will invite candidates to fill out inventories of their views, and they will publish those to their members or supporters. So the 2 things that are only 2 things that are allowed with respect to candidates are debates, where you host a debate and all candidates are invited, or issue summaries, where you invite all candidates to be a part of the same conversation and that broad topics or areas are addressed. So again, this is the first hurdle. Do not endorse any single candidate in any race. The next area of concern is lobbying. This is what most of us think of when we think about advocacy. There are organizations and firms that clearly just work in a lobbying perspective. And many of us, even my arts organization, has groups or entities that focus just on lobbying in their industry or in their interest area. We're not talking about those 501c4s where that's their job. We're talking about the 501c3s that don't do or work in government, but do want to be involved in trying to talk about things that are of interest to them. There are 2 ways that a nonprofit can go about lobbying. The first is a direct action, that's speaking directly to your legislative officials. And the other is an indirect action, where you're sending out information and trying to influence public reaction, trying to spur activity. You can, as a 501c3 lobby, you can talk directly to elected officials about specific pending bills or legislative actions. And in certain circumstances, you should be the one doing that because you're the one that can best relay your message and the needs of your constituency to the elected officials. If we all step back and we don't have those conversations, keep in mind that your elected officials don't know your work, they don't know your constituency, and many times they don't live or work physically in your space. And that's important to note. If you're talking about federal legislation, all of our representatives, our senators and our congressmen are generally working in Washington, D.C. They don't come out to Western Nebraska unless we have a really big reason. So they don't know what we're doing. They've never heard of the ISIS theater. They have no idea what we're talking about unless we share information with them. So lobbying is accepted. And again, this is speaking specifically to elected officials about pending legislation. However, you cannot make that a substantial part of your work. If you do, then you start violating that IRS test. There are two different ways that IRS and the government will look at the work you're doing to determine if you're in violation of that law or not. Again, lobbying is allowed. Don't be afraid of it, but it is subject to limitations. These are the two tests that apply. Most organizations that are 501c3s will fall under the substantial part test. It is a gray area. It is not a firm line test. Just keep that in mind. But case law indicates time and again that generally if you're spending about 5% of your organization's annual budget on lobbying activity, you're still fine. That's not a substantial part of what you do. It's a little sideline thing that you might do once in a while. Keep in mind if you're subject to the substantial part test, however, that you do have to include the time that employees and volunteers do in furtherance of that part of the mission. So if you're sending a volunteer, in my case, I was the president, if you're sending a volunteer to testify to a legislative committee hearing or to talk to an elected official, they need to keep track of their time so that you just have the bookkeeping in order, so that if anybody ever asks, did what you do fall within this concern, you can say, no, it didn't. It was just a few hours of our time. Or no, it didn't. It only cost us a little bit to print the postcards. But you want to have that documentation available. So if you foray into talking specifically to elected officials about a bill, and you're a smaller organization or subject to the substantial part test, just keep the records. If you're a larger organization or an organization that finds that it may have a voice more frequently, then you might want to consider making your organization subject to the expenditures test. This is the alternate way that the IRS looks at whether or not you're violating the law. In order to claim an expenditures test for your organization, you have to file an election before that calendar year or fiscal year that says, IRS, we're going to follow the expenditures test going forward. So once you make that election, then you can see that it's a firm line mathematical formula. And an organization that has $1.5 million for an annual budget can actually allocate $225,000 a year to lobbying of their elected officials and not violate the law. And the good thing under the expenditures test is volunteer time is not taken into account. It's staff time and actual expense or cost. So again, it's really easy to make these contacts and to have these conversations and not violate the IRS rules. Most people don't understand that you can do this. And so that's the first thing that we want to point out today. The third way that you can influence activity at the government level is by advocacy. And interestingly, you want to know that advocacy is not lobbying. Advocacy is not subject to the IRS limitations at all. It is not talking to officials. It is not trying to influence a specific bill. It's trying to be active in your area of practice or area of interest by sharing information and educating others. If you just take steps to educate others about any issue that's important to you in a broad sense, you can do that at any time It is not subject to any of the limitations or either of the tests for lobbying. Examples of things that organizations do on a regular basis. You can publicly present your research or the research your organizations do in that area. So if you're an LGBTQ focused or oriented organization, you can do research about the impact for youth and publish those white papers. Share that information. You can, as an organization, express viewpoints on specific issues. If it's the work that you do, in my case, we're an arts organization. If I know that arts education is being challenged or that art education funding is being limited, I can absolutely, as the executive director, talk to the public in various ways, mail, radio, podcasts, TV. I can go tell people, hey, these are mistakes. We need to fund arts education. That's a general conversation I can have at any time, and it isn't subject to any test. I can impact legislation. I can serve as the plaintiff in a lawsuit against the government. That's what you see happening around the country right now, where there are concerns about funding that's been stopped. I can, as the attorney for an organization, I could submit an amicus brief or a friend of the court brief in any pending legislation to say, hey, you need to look at this, this is wrong. I can educate policymakers and their staff. I can go to my congressman's office and talk to him generally about arts education. I'm not referencing any specific bill. I'm just having an educational conversation. That is allowed at any time. You can also mobilize public demonstrations that are general in nature. And again, we're seeing that happen all around the country. So those are the important things that you need to think about. Direct political intervention, not allowed. Don't focus on any one candidate. Provide information if you're involving both or all candidates. If you're lobbying, speaking directly to a specific elected official about a specific bill, you have to follow one or two of the tests. Advocacy, however, isn't subject to any limitation. So keep in mind, whether or to what extent your organization works in lobbying is going to be up to your mission and your budget and your team's comfort level. And I want to point out your team's comfort level because you don't want to assume that the person doing data entry at your office can't also go talk to their friends about your mission. You want your story being told by everyone that works for you, depending on their comfort level. At the time that I went and testified for the bill at the legislature, there were members of our board that would not have been comfortable doing that at all and would not have been able to do it effectively. But there were fantastic members in our organization that were happy to go knock door to door on the businesses in our community and tell them our story. So know your team and know their comfort level and send them out and let them start talking to people. That's the storytelling that we want to share, and we want everyone to know what you're doing and why it's important to the people you're serving. Things, again, you can do. You can research and share the results. You can advocate to rule makers. That's an important distinction. Rule-making bodies are agencies of the government that are just making the rules, as opposed to lawmakers that are making policy. We'll circle back to that in a minute. You can express viewpoints on generalized issues. You can do issue-related mail, radio, TV. Again, these are the other things I kind of talked about and would encourage you to consider doing on a regular basis. No one else knows your story as well as you do. So if you're not sharing it, keep in mind no one's going to. So now we're going to go back to the examples I gave. Let's talk first about the fire marshal letter. I can tell you our state fire marshal had never heard directly from a property owner in quite so expressive a manner. I sent the letter on a Sunday night. By 10 o'clock on Monday, I had had direct call from the state fire marshal's office telling me they were looking at it. and they had made the changes in our plans by noon. So we had sat on the issue for over a month without adequately explaining our story to the fire marshal. And as soon as we explained it, they changed the recommendations and requirements. Had I never said anything, had I not written our story down and showed them why we didn't need those extra exits, we would probably have spent another $100,000 knocking a hole in the wall. So it was a rule-making entity and not a policy-making entity. So what I did in sending that letter actually wasn't lobbying at all. It was advocacy. It was not something subject to those limitations or tests. We'll talk about the next one. This is just a fun picture. This is our theater completed with a class of second graders in it. You can see the teachers on the back in the handicapped accessibility area, and it looks much better without an extra door knocked in the side of the building. Let's go back to story number 2. When we were at our own gala and we encouraged our attendees to contact their elected officials, and we provided them postcards so they could do that. There is gray area here. It is possible that that was not considered lobbying at all, because we weren't asking them to write their elected officials about any specific legislation that was pending. If the government would say in this review that no, that was not lobbying, then it wasn't even subject to either of the tests. It was advocacy and it was allowed. So again, was it lobbying or education? That there's gray room. I could see that it might be subject to the substantial part test. So in this situation, our budget that year was about $100,000. We spent $50 for the postcard, and I spent about 2 hours of my time prepping the presentation. So we had a lot less than 25% of our budget spent on this project. Because I was calling out city officials in a public manner, even though I am an attorney and I knew that it met the financial test, I did go get a legal opinion from an outside attorney before we took this step. That was simply to protect our organization and to make sure I was speaking correctly and telling my board the correct information so they could decide if we were willing to do this. As a result of that advocacy, and because the public stepped up and told our city council that they wanted to see them be involved in the project in a more direct way, we did receive a $355,000 economic development grant from the city later that year. And so this is the renovated lobby, and the first name in the top left corner is the city of Crete for their financial support. Let's go back to story number 1, testifying in front of the state legislature. I'll tell you a little more about the Shovel Ready Recovery Act because it's kind of fun. In 2020, our board started telling our story. We rewrote our mission, our vision, and our values, and we started telling it to anyone that would listen. We were doing that in terms of talking to arts organizations around the state. We were talking to the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands. We were members of that organization and they lobby. We were also writing grants to various foundations asking for financial assistance. So we were telling our story about the theater in many different ways in 2020 and in 2021. Because we were telling our story and everyone knew about our theater, particularly the fact that we tried to launch a capital campaign on Leap Day and then shut it down 2 weeks later, we were the perfect story for the bill that was pending in the legislature. I wasn't following the legislature at that time. I was contacted actually by the state arts organization and asked to share our story in support of this bill. I did the research. I looked into what that bill involved. I said, hey, yes, this is exactly what I'm trying to do for our organization, and I see how this bill can help everyone in the state. So I went and testified. The bill passed the Nebraska legislature, allocated $115 million of federal ARPA money to nonprofit organizations in the state, like ours. They opened that grant portal in 2022, and our organization received $333,500 in a direct grant from the state DED. Because we received the government money from the city, because we received the state money, and because we continued to tell our story over the next few years, the theater actually completed a $2.2 million renovation and opened in July of 2024. But because I told our story, and because I supported that bill, that $115 million actually went to 76 different nonprofit organizations throughout the state of Nebraska, and it made life-altering or project-altering contributions to 76 organizations. These are some of the other projects that were stuck after COVID that happened because of the Shovel Ready Recovery Act. Here's a few photos of us on opening day. You can see our board in our new renovated concession stand, and you can see the front of the building. Again, these are things that would not have happened had we not started telling our story and had we not been willing to talk to government officials as we progressed. So at this point, I wanted to open it up to questions. I think JD's been kind of policing those so that I could focus on the conversation. But I'm going to just throw that out there now, JD, and let us know how I can answer questions or what other concerns have come up.
Yes, thank you, Shay. We do have a few questions that are generic enough that I think we can start with those to expand the information that you have provided. And if people have some other specific questions, maybe we can dive into those. One of the first questions that we received was about, you mentioned talking to elected officials about pending legislation. Could you work with legislators to introduce new legislation?
You can. It needs to be kept in mind that you're going to be subject to either that substantial part test or that economic test. So if your organization wants to foray into introducing legislation or trying to get a legislator to introduce a specific bill on your behalf, keep track of your time, keep track of the expense spent to do that, and make sure you're not violating one of those tests, whichever one applies to your organization. But absolutely, if you know, for example, that your organization or your constituency would benefit if they raise the minimum wage, and you want to talk to your legislature about introducing a bill to do that, you can do that. That is allowed.
Great, thank you. Another person asked about what's the downside of filing Form 5768?
If you're a larger organization or you're going to do this regularly, there isn't a downside. I would strongly encourage you to make that election. If you're a small organization like ours, and even now that we're open, our budget's about $250,000 a year. We're small. We're not going to foray into that with any regularity. You know, I might be involved in one issue every year or two. I wouldn't make the election simply because we don't want to pay an attorney to do that, and it doesn't affect us on a weekly or daily basis. So it's really about your organization's comfort level and whether you see yourself doing more of it. If you don't, it's not necessary. But if you see yourself doing it, I encourage you to make the election.
That's a great point. I think what I'm hearing you say is you have to know the power of your own organization and your services and the people that you work with, because so I guess there's different ways of putting your story out there, right? And you're saying that there's not just one formula, that you probably have to approach it from different perspectives and combine all of those to hit the different ways to educate the public, legislators.
Right. And if you're just educating the public and you continue to do that on a regular basis, that's advocacy, and that's not subject to any test or limitation anyway. I think that's the thing that most nonprofits are scared about.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like they can't foray into explaining things to the public, especially on a political issue in our politically charged society right now. But you can and you should, because you can tell that story best. And it's not lobbying, it's not subject to any limitation. If you're going to foray into specific bill conversations, then you should probably consider the election.
So the strategy has to be comprehensive and try to work the multiple areas in which you can influence that. So let me give you an example. What about if you are an organization dedicated to environmental protection, and you know that there's going to be an upcoming election and there's two candidates, and one is for the protection of local park or something along those lines, and another one, you kind of know that they're not interested in that environmental stuff, but they're not willing to participate in any kind of panel discussion or debate or anything like that. Is that killing that conversation, that opportunity? You have to pivot to do something else? Or can you still say, we invite the one that wants to kind of explain their point of view, and the other person, we invited them, but they just didn't want to participate?
Absolutely, you can have that conversation as long as you've invited all of the candidates. And frequently, you'll see organizations do this in written inventory form. They'll ask each candidate to fill out, hey, here's the top 6 or 8 issues that we think the public's interested in this year. Would you like to provide your opinion? And we'll share that with all of our members. You can do that. You can't endorse one or the other of the candidates.
When counting the budget for the financial test, does it include the billable hours for all volunteer activities, or is that just taken into account for the lobbying time spent?
Again, it's gray. Unfortunately, when it's a substantial part test and you're including volunteer time, your budget, your gross budget for the year should be giving some value to your volunteer time anyway. If you've got volunteers, in our situation, all of the shows are staffed by volunteers in 4-hour shifts. So we know generally how much, if we're going $15 an hour at minimum wage for volunteers, we kind of have an idea in our $250,000 budget that $50,000 of that is actually volunteer time and not money that's being spent. So we would have that as in our gross figure, and you should be doing that on a regular basis anyway. You want that volunteer time to have some economic value to you. And so then it would just be paring down which volunteers worked on this particular bill or had this particular lobbying action. And those hours would go to the substantial part test. So you've got your gross hours as part of your gross budget, and then you've got the lobbying specific hours in your substantial part test. Does that make sense, JD?
Yeah, I think I can follow that. So kind of going back to what we were talking a minute ago about the way that you have to look at the comprehensive view of your storytelling. How do you put all that together? What's the strategy behind that? Do you come up with the storytelling and then kind of divide that into the different ways in which the organization can contribute to that? Do you assess your own internal powers and resources? What's the step-by-step, if there's a formula?
In our situation, we were working specifically on this capital campaign. So we had focused most of our time and energy on it and had started in the same way that you would any capital campaign. We had the budget, we had people on the ground making contacts with donors, we had a grant writing campaign, and then we had the government advocacy campaign. So we had basically 3 different funding pots we were considering as part of the capital campaign. We had the private donations, the foundation gifts, and the government money. So we had allocated our time and our resources in those 3 different paths. If you are talking just on a day-to-day operational manner, I strongly suggest that your entire organization have a strategic plan. And as part of that strategic plan, you want to know what your story is, what your organization does, and how you communicate that to all of your different public-facing organizations, whether it's funders, whether it's the people that you serve, whether it's the government officials that impact policy. If everyone in your organization knows and believes in the same story, those conversations flow naturally in everything that you do. If I'm going to talk to a funder and I'm going to sit down and say, hey, we need some money for this show that we want to put on, this is what our organization does and how we do it, wonderful. If we're going to market that show to the general public, I can say, this is what our organization is, and this is what we do, and this is why you should be a part of this event. So that story weaves itself throughout your marketing, throughout your management style. It's that mission, vision, values that you have to keep coming back to. And that's why I said our organization actually had to take a step back and start over. After I did my CNP training, I understood that we had not started correctly. We didn't have that easy narrative. We didn't have that story that all of the board members and volunteers could share. So we went back and we created that story together as a group before we relaunched. And it made all of the difference. It made us, again, weave that story through everything that we did.
That's very helpful. I think you're saying that this is not a committee or an initiative that is limited in time. It's part of the DNA of the organization, and it's all hands on deck. And yeah, there might be some specific campaigns that you're dedicated to, but that should be 24/7 sort of situation.
Absolutely, and that's when it's most successful. When you've got the, and people set employees aside based on their job description. They're like, oh, she just does data entry for the financials. She may be one of your best advocates because her heart may truly believe and understand the work that you're doing. You don't want to discount her voice. You want to let her have those conversations with her friends and family too. So when you empower everyone across your board, everyone across your employees, everyone across your volunteers, with the same tools and the same story, they can tell it in their own voice, but it's still the same story.
And to what extent can you include volunteers or people who are not staff, who might not know the limitations of what to say or what not to say into those campaigns or those efforts? Do you need to educate them so that they don't say the wrong thing and then the organization feels the backlash of that?
The thing that we tell volunteers is that they cannot talk to elected officials about a specific bill without our administration being involved in the conversation. It's the easiest way to protect our organization. You get volunteers that are very enthusiastic, and as long as they know they can't endorse a candidate, if you're wearing my volunteer t-shirt, my ISIS Theater t-shirt, you cannot in public endorse a single candidate. If you're wearing my ISIS Theater volunteer t-shirt, you cannot talk to a legislator directly about a specific bill without us being involved in the conversation. It doesn't mean they're not they may be the perfect person to have that conversation. We just tell them they need to let us know if they want to have that conversation because we need to keep track of it. So it's really simple, really easy rules, clear, bright line. Don't talk about candidates. Easy rule. If you want to talk to legislators about bills, let us know.
Makes sense. Somebody asked a question. So how many exits does the ISIS Theater have?
We have 3. We have the front doors that you see in this photo. We have the door at the back of the building, and there was an existing door on the side back by the stage. We did not have to put new exits in the front of the building.
Good. Those are most of the questions that I've seen coming through, unless we have another one. If there's any final comment, put together all the information that you have provided us or any next steps that maybe you would suggest for the audience, we'll take that now.
Absolutely. My contact information just went up. I know that they have the slide deck that they're going to send, I believe, later. I will warn you as you get involved into advocacy and you find that you can be helpful in this realm, you might get additional requests. I'm currently running for the Nebraska legislature. So don't discount the impact that you can have in telling your story, making it relevant to everyone else. But if it's done passionately and it's done well, then that's your job in nonprofit land.
Very good. Thank you.
You bet.
Well, I think we're getting, go ahead.
I'll just say thank you for having me today.
Thank you for all the information you provided us. So we're getting to the end of the time that we have allocated for this session. Thank you, Shay. Thank you for all your shared insights. Just repeat what Shay just mentioned, that we'll be sure to send the recording of the session within the next few days. So expect that. I know that there were some issues with the sound for some of you. So hopefully with the information that we will send in the next few days, you get all the details that you wanted from this session. I hope that was helpful. As a reminder, the Association of CNPs hosts events like this throughout the year. So have an idea for a future session or have questions about becoming a CNP, you can reach out to us at cnpcredential@nla1.org. There's some information in the chat for all of you. And with that, I want to thank all of you for attending today's session. I hope that you learned something, and we'll see you at the next one.